on trade development in an interdependent world, policy implications for governments and the WTO. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today, and it's also a great pleasure to have two very distinguished guests who are leading thinkers on trade and development, Daria Taglioni and Ottaviano Canuto. Thank you both for joining us. I would also like to thank our Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, for making the time to be with us today. Dr. Ngozi, we're very happy that you are here with us. And before I give the floor to Dr. Ngozi for her opening remarks, let me mention that we have both French and Spanish interpretation, so please feel free to select your language. And let me also introduce our two speakers and say a few words about today's event. Daria Taglioni is a research manager of the Trade and International Research Program at the World Bank. Prior to that, she held various positions and roles, including team and task lead for the World Development Report 2020, principal economist in the International Finance Corporation, and World Bank's global lead on global value chains. Before joining the World Bank, Daria held positions at the European Central Bank and the OECD. Daria has been driving much of the exciting recent work at the World Bank on trade-led development and global value chains. So few people are better placed than her to walk us through the main findings and policy implications of that rich body of policy-oriented work. Our discussant today is Ottaviano Canuto, who is principal at the Center for Macroeconomics and Development, senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He has extensive experience at the most senior levels of the World Bank, the IMF, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And Ottaviano has also served as Deputy Minister for International Affairs in Brazil's Ministry of Finance and as a professor of economics. So I have to say that I recently enjoyed reading Ottaviano's article with Justin Lee and Pepe Zhang on geopoliticized industrial policy. And in that article, the authors make a compelling case for developing countries to pay more attention to economic fundamentals and resist the temptation to resort to the industrial policy playbook of the past for answers on how to reap the benefits of a changing global trade landscape. So Daria and Ottaviano, we are delighted to have you with us, and thank you very much for taking the time. Today's event provides an opportunity for big picture thinking and debate about the future of trade and development and how the WTO must adapt to continue to make a difference. It's particularly important to have this discussion now in the wake of our successful ministerial conference last month, when ministers agreed to launch a process to reform the WTO, among several other important decisions. So over the next 90 minutes, we will hear about major trends that are reshaping the global trade landscape. We will delve into the latest data and analysis to help clarify some of the central questions around trade-led development in the 21st century. Some of these are, to what extent can trade continue to drive economic growth and poverty reduction, but also the degree to which trade affects income inequality and environmental sustainability? How are technologies reshaping trade, and what are the challenges and opportunities created by modern technologies for developing countries? Whether global supply chains make economies more vulnerable to risks and shocks, and how can we strengthen the resilience of global production networks in a world of more frequent and severe shocks? How do deepening geopolitical risks and trade tensions affect trade and growth opportunities, especially for the most vulnerable countries? And of course, what are some policy implications of all of this, including for the WTO of the future? So our research team here at the WTO has been doing a fantastic job in bringing evidence-based analysis to help answer many of these questions, as have our colleagues at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased to see that our two organizations have stepped up collaboration to shed additional light on trade and development policy issues. More recently, through great work on trade and pandemic recovery and trade and global health. So all of this is very encouraging. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. We will kick off with opening remarks from our Director General, to be followed by Daria's presentation. And then after that, Ottaviano will come in as a discussant. And hopefully we will have some time to take questions from the floor. So without any further ado, let me give the floor to you, Dr. Rincos.
Well, thank you so much, Annabelle, and thanks for putting this up, you and a wonderful team. As you said, I want to welcome Daria and congratulate her on the great work she's been doing with her team. And it's absolutely wonderful to see Ottaviano again, and an old friend, and an out-of-the-box thinker. So it will be very interesting to appreciate his remarks on this. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. I think we are going to have a fascinating discussion, and I don't want to take away time from it. So let me just make a few quick observations. Back in the 1980s, Robert Lucas, the future Nobel Economics laureate, was looking at how per capita incomes in rich countries were as much as 40 times higher than in poor ones, and at how a handful of poor economies had managed to achieve large and sustained increases in growth rates, but most had not. Koreans were on track to be 32 times better off than their grandparents, but people in other developing countries would be lucky if living standards had doubled over 2 generations. He wrote, and I quote, "The consequences for human welfare involved in questions like these are simply staggering. Once one starts to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else," unquote. Like a lot of us here today, I've spent a great deal of time thinking about economic development and practicing it. And over the past 40 years, we've had some answers, but also many new questions. And trade is at the center of both. As Lucas was writing that paper, many more developing countries were beginning to tap into global trade and value chains to drive growth, structural transformation, and job creation. We've seen a huge increase in global trade and a dramatic reduction in poverty. In 1980, over 40% of the world population lived on under the equivalent of $1.90 a day. By the eve of the pandemic, this share had fallen to less than a tenth. But new questions arose. How come some poor countries were able to successfully break into world markets for value-added goods and services, while so many others struggled to do so? These countries were not alone in being left behind. In some rich countries, large numbers of poor and lower middle class people were being left out of the gains from trade and growth. Their frustration helped fuel anti-trade populism. Even in increasingly integrated emerging markets, economic inequality was increasing, potentially sowing the seeds of a future backlash. So we have to ask, how can trade be an instrument for greater socioeconomic inclusion? As the threat posed to lives and livelihoods by climate change came into clearer view, questions arose about the environmental impact of trade. More trade meant more transport-related emissions. At the same time, it meant faster diffusion of cleaner technologies and made it possible to grow more food where soil and water were abundant rather than scarce. How should we think about these links? Another set of concerns came from the rise of increasingly sophisticated technology. Trade-led growth often involved export-oriented manufacturing jobs. But what would happen if more of those jobs were increasingly done by machines? Can services fill the void? The COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have prompted fresh rounds of re-examination of trade, value chains, and interdependence, whether they make us more vulnerable or more resilient. But these debates had started years before, as rising geopolitical tensions led some to call for economic decoupling between rival blocs. These are important questions requiring evidence-based debates and policy choices. After all, people warning that machines would lead to mass unemployment have been empirically wrong for about 200 years, but that doesn't mean they will continue to be. Daria and Ottaviano do fantastic work to put facts on the ground about these big questions. The World Bank has done stellar work on global value chains, threats to the manufacturing-led growth model, possibilities for services-led development, and of course, the joint studies that our wonderful team has also carried out with the World Bank and other organizations. Annabelle referred to some of that. From our ongoing analytical work here, it is clear that trade is part of the solution to the big problems we face. This is a mantra I repeat everywhere. Supply chains have been vital in responding to the pandemic, and cooperation on trade will be essential to mitigate and manage the effects of the current food crisis. Greening our economies to get to net zero will be more expensive and less efficient unless we leverage the full potential of trade. Decoupling would be tremendously costly, and deglobalization will create supply vulnerability problems of its own. In contrast, a process of reglobalization, by which I mean building deeper and more diverse international markets, by bringing countries and communities from the margins of the global economy to the mainstream, offers a more promising path to build more resilient markets whilst reducing poverty and exclusion. Places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia have already expanded their footprint in global manufacturing, and costs have risen in China and elsewhere in East Asia. We need to extend this further to other places in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. The WTO toolkit can help foster this re-globalization process. Trade facilitation, services trade liberalization, and regulatory cooperation and prospective rules on digital trade would help countries lower trade costs and tap into value chains. Let me leave it here. There's a lot to unpack, and I look very much forward to the discussion. I hope all of you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ngozi, for those remarks. Let me now turn it over to Daria, please, to begin her presentation. Daria.
Thank you, and I will be sharing my screen. And thanks. Perfect. I hope everybody can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm trying to launch it as a slideshow. Let's see. I think, sorry, I seem to have just a moment in which my screen is dark. Is that the case also for you?
No, we see your screen. We see the first slide, not in slideshow mode, but we see the slide.
Okay. Give me just 1 minute because I was just having a black screen. So, okay.
We can see it now.
Okay, let's perhaps try to leave it like that because it seems it creates problems when, sorry for the technical part. So the introduction of, I'm sorry, but my computer doesn't seem to be responding.
Let me see if we can upload it from our side. Carson, could you please try?
Yes.
Perfect.
There you go, Daria.
Perfect. And if it can be put on presentation mode, that will help. Perfect. Thanks. So next slide, please. Thanks so much, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. I think your introduction couldn't be more fitting because all the questions you raised are precisely the question we also were asking. And I hope to be able to at least bring some perspective on some of them. So I'm not going to repeat the first slides in the interest of time, but as Dr. Okonjo-Iweala said, we had this incredible increase in global trade. And I think the point I want to make here is that it was very inclusive, meaning developing countries moved from representing 16% of global trade in 1980 to 36% at the peak in 2015. Next slide, please. And this came associated with an unprecedented drop in all dimensions of poverty. And the most staggering number is one we all know very well at the World Bank, but I like to remind the audience here, and it is the extreme poverty, the poverty head count ratio at $1.90 a day, which dropped from 42.6% in 1980 to 8.6% in 2018, which is the last data point we have. Next. And what I will try to make the case in this presentation is that these two things were correlated. And yet, I mean, although we have a lot of evidence that there was some correlation, influence of trade in helping this staggering reduction in poverty to happen, we still have that the public perception around trade has grown more skeptical. And what is surprising is that a number of developing countries, which were among the main beneficiaries of this expansion of trade, such as Turkey, that are the ones in purple in this scatter, Turkey, Mexico, South Africa, Russia, Ghana, Uganda, even China, saw some skepticism grow over time about trade. Next slide, please. So what I will do in this talk is basically four things. First, I will talk about the gains from trade, and I will try to remind what are the mechanisms that link trade to poverty reduction and development. Second, I will tackle two of the challenges that were mentioned, and it is the changing technologies, whether they are indeed a threat to this export-led model, and the exposure to shocks, whether international trade makes us all more exposed to shocks. What I will say here is that perhaps we are overemphasizing these threats at the expense of what I think are the three key threats. And this is really my take, is not the World Bank, and it is the environment, where indeed there are opportunities and costs, but we need to understand how this works. Workers and geostrategic tensions. And so finally, I will give some pointers to the policy implication, but leave really the space for the policy discussion to Ottaviano and then to the discussion, which is much, and so speakers that are better placed than me to give the details on that. Okay, so coming to the first question, what are the gains from participation? Next slide, please. So the first point is productivity. Traders are more productive than non-traders. When we did the World Development Report 2020, we looked at this question from the point of view of disaggregated firm level data and also aggregated data. And I will show aggregate data later. But basically what we found is that it doesn't matter in which country and country at which level of development, the firms that do export and import are the most productive, and followed by those that either import only or export only. And the baseline, so these bars represent the difference between the productivity of the group of firms that I mentioned and firms that are only operating domestically. So that's the first point. Firms that do trade are most productive. And indeed, when we put it in aggregate data, we also see that this translates both in greater aggregate productivity, but also in income, in positive income growth. And if the short-term impacts are low, the long-term impacts, the impacts on steady state are quite significant. And so when we look at whether is it the level of trade openness that matters, simple trade or participation in global value chains, the answer is that the bulk of growth in income, but in productivity is very similar figures, comes precisely from GVC participation. And so here, this just provides the growth in steady state, so over the long term, in per capita GDP, from a 10% increase in the level of trade openness, and this is equal to 2.5%. The level of simple trade, again, around 2.5, 2.6%, and GVC participation, which is above 8%. Okay, next slide. And so how does this link to poverty? So there is not a direct effect between trade and poverty reduction. However, we see this strong correlation. And so to do that, we think that the subnational unit is the cleanest way to measure it. And so we had data that were, again, in the World Development Report, where we could do that for Vietnam. And we saw that it's exactly in those provinces where firms that both imported and exported that were more prevalent, that we saw the greatest poverty reduction, which if you click is just the next, yeah, perfect. So here you see there is a one-on-one correspondence. Okay, next slide. And so what is the mechanism? So basically the mechanism is the following, and it explains some of the critiques that we hear from, for instance, Roderick. So trade opens, increases productivity, but it also creates a structural change towards more capital intense activities. And so the units of labor that are generated from this new activity are less than the unit of labor that would be generated from the activities that have been replaced. However, because there is more productivity and because there is more capital, the scale of production increases and you get a positive net effect on overall employment from the scale. And that's really the twist. So you have more capital intensive activity. So when you measure it, the marginal contribution to labor is less, but because of the scale effect, you also get positive effects on employment. And here I'm just showing figures how this mechanism worked in Ethiopia, where, as you see, the capital intensity increased way more than employment, but also the increase in employment was positive. Next slide, please. The other question that we asked is, again, this is again from the World Development Report is, when is it that the countries' growth is the highest? And it is really when they, in that particular moment where countries move from commodity production and exports into limited manufacturing. That's where we see the highest growth over time. This is the accumulated change in GDP per capita after 20 years, which is equal to 57%. But this is also a very important one when countries move then from limited manufacturing to advanced manufacturing and services, and then again from this stage of development into innovative activities. And because they start from a higher level, a 32% increase in accumulated GDP per capita in this latest stage is not a subdued growth compared to the one where they move from commodities to limited manufacturing. Okay, next slide, please. So this is basically the overall effect. So basically productivity effects plus capital intensity, the trigger increases in employment through the scale effect, and the three together lead to poverty reduction and even extreme poverty reduction. Then the next question is, okay, is this the only model developing countries can use to grow? Or is there an alternative model? In other words, can countries achieve the same through a closed economy? And what we find is actually that for so first of all, for all countries in the world, the level of development that they would achieve through the global economy is higher than the one they would achieve in a closed economy. But more importantly, for the 50% countries that are poorer than the median, poorer than the average, in fact, than the median, we would actually not reach a level or a size of the economy that would allow for sustainable development, for sustainable poverty reduction. And so this is what two colleagues at the World Bank, our former chief economist Penny Goldberg with Tristan Reed, did in a paper in 2020, where they calculated that the minimum size of a market to achieve sustained poverty reduction is a bit more than 300 million people, and that this size wouldn't be possible to be achieved in a closed economy setting for 50% of the countries in the world. Next slide, please. So in light of all this, now we come to the question that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala mentioned is, are we, however, at the end of an era simply because we have new technologies? And so next slide. So this is again the question that colleagues at the World Bank looked at. And in particular, I want to mention three pieces of evidence. One is about automation. And so colleagues in my team actually found that it is precisely in those industries where there is more automation that we see more exports of parts and components from the south to the north, meaning those industries in rich countries that automate the most are also those that then expand more the imports of parts and components in those industries. So there is so far it doesn't seem that more automation has led to a reduction in exports. And then another piece of evidence in the next slide shows that even when we look at very specific case, and again, colleagues at the World Bank looked at the case of hearing aids, which are at this point produced completely on 3D printing, and 3D printing is the machine that everybody thinks allows to do things at home, that actually also leads to more trade, more than comparable products, and more than comparable high-tech products. So the purple line is the hearing aids, and the white and gray lines are other high-tech or comparable products. And so their finding is that the exports increased by 60% precisely after the switch to 3D printing. Next, and in the Q&A, if of interest, so I can try to explain more the mechanism. And so the question that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala asked is, can services replay? So we saw that not necessarily automation challenges trade flows, but indeed the reality that automation is also happening in the south of the world might mean that workers will be less able to benefit from that. And so the question is, so what about services? And so here the sense is really that we are at a juncture or at the beginning of a new wave of globalization led by data intensive services. And if you click, I have a couple of messages on this slide. Yes, perfect. And so the idea is that really accelerated by the pandemic, firms and people are investing in digital equipment literacy. The impact is a leveling off of the domestic and international trade costs. And because this type of activity is akin to a sunk cost, so a cost that is not recoverable, the impact is likely to be durable. Next, and this is work we are carrying out. So this is for the new technologies, where I think the main message is the jury is still out, but we should expect that other activities will benefit from these new technologies in a way that reduces international costs and actually might bring new jobs to the south of the world. The other big question that is in everybody's mind when we think about trade these days is exposure to shocks. And the sort of common wisdom is that there is a trade-off. You know, people think, okay, we understand that trade will allow us to do things more efficiently, to produce more in larger scale, but this comes at the cost of being exposed to more shocks. And what I want to convince you here is that this is, again, not entirely correct. So let's look at the slides. And so why is not entirely correct? Because this reasoning is based on papers, very good papers, which look at specific accidents like the flooding in Thailand or the earthquake and nuclear disaster of 2011 in Japan. And so these shocks and the methodologies that are used that basically track down the propagation of those specific shocks around the world, they do assume as a counterfactual, or they basically ignore that that these shocks do not take, that the alternative state of the world is not a world without shock, but is a world where countries are more exposed to domestic shocks. And so one way to look at this is to compare the exposure to international shocks to the exposure to domestic shocks. And when you do that, you really see that there is a change in the state of the world, where indeed with more global value chain and trade participation, the exposure to international shocks increases, but the exposure to the domestic shocks decreases one-to-one. And so next slide, the next question was for us to ask, okay, but then if that's the case, is domestic output in general more volatile because of shocks that happen domestically or shocks that happen internationally? And it turns out that for 90% of the countries and industries in the world, actually the majority of the shocks they are exposed to are the domestic ones. And that's why switching exposure from domestic to international linkages might actually be a form of over the long run, might be a form of actually reducing, dampening the overall exposure of a country to shocks. Next. And the story behind is just the story of market diversification, or if you want and you know finance, is just the portfolio allocation to risk. If I do trade, I have many more links with the countries that have a business cycle that is very different from mine. And as a result of that, I can dampen my specific shocks. And so the message is we should certainly be looking into strong external dependency in key inputs. Those remain and they are very disruptive, but this shouldn't come at the cost of also understanding that there are benefits that come from higher market differentiation, and that it's unlikely that any domestic or regional strategy would give something that can substitute the type of extreme market diversification that international and, for that matter, global trade can bring. And in fact, we tested that explicitly, and we saw that regional solutions or engagement in traditional trade instead of global value chain gives intermediate forms of exposure, simply because, again, business cycles are more correlated. Okay, that's the story here. And so finally, we say, okay, perhaps this type of two worries in the public debate should be recast a bit, but then there are three things that really worry me. And one is the environment. Let's go to the next. Oops, unwanted animation. Okay, mixed effect on the environment. So next. So if we look at this, this is just a chart that shows that there is a positive correlation between the material footprint and CO2 emissions that grew over the period growth and the growth in trade during the long 90s. And so what we did in the next slide is to put everything in a regression. And what we find is three key things. So message number one, please. Okay, message number one. Trade per se does not induce environmental degradation. Could you still click further? Yes, so there is a negative point estimate for material footprint and CO2 consumption, and this says that there are efficiency gains from trade, in short. So trade per se is not the problem. Next. And in fact, the example is one that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala also mentioned, that, this is work from the IBRD 2019, and where they find that trade in agricultural products saved 4% of the global footprint of water over the 10 years up to 2005. So next. So the second message is that the rising incomes are actually associated with more use of natural resources and pollutions. Please click further. And so the issue is really that trade generates a scale of production. We saw it before. And it is through this scale and more and rising incomes that we get that individuals consume more and produce more transport and more waste. And so there is a counter effect of technology whereby richer countries are expected to be cleaner, but what we find is that they become cleaner in production, but not in consumption. And so this more efficient production of the new technology is not enough to offset the scale effect. And so the message here is really that we need to push further on technologies that can actually offset, more than offset the scale effect. Next. And the last important point is that we find that, however, there is one effect that dominates, and it is that more capital-intensive countries pollute more. Capital-intensive countries are those that use more natural resources and pollute more. And actually, it is high and middle-income countries that tend to be more capital-intensive rather than low-income countries. And so really the key of the solution is really on their hands. Next, and we can jump and we can catch up. Yes, so that's on the climate. The second point is about workers. And here I will try to go fast, but the next slide. But the basics is that indeed, as I showed before, the new technologies that are enabled by trade are more capital intensive, and therefore, as a result, when we look at the labor share over GDP, it's clear that this has declined over time, and this has declined both in developing and in developed countries. This is something that trade theory wasn't expecting. Next, please click. But the empirics contradict what we have seen. And so there has been a standard explanation for this declining labor share, and has been that trade has played a secondary role, and that we actually were really looking at effects of technology. This is in part true, and this is what this slide showed, this domestic within industry factors is technology, but there is a role of play. It's a useful explanation, but we also find still negative impact when we control for technology. And so there is a new consensus that emerging, and I think is very important, and that's why this year the World Bank is doing a World Development Report around it, and it's factor mobility, and in particular labor mobility and migration. And so the new consensus that is emerging is that the main culprit is that we haven't really properly dealt with the factor adjustment costs. So next slide. And so there has been a huge literature which would be worth a seminar per se, but basically we started seeing this problem with the frictions of mobility being linked to the cost of globalization when we started to take a space lens instead of industry or occupational lens. And so what I think the second bullet is the most important. It's a paper by colleagues in my unit that they show that of all dimensions of worker mobility, which are all correlated with one another, geographical moving costs are the most damaging. And so worker welfare increases significantly more than when reducing several other moving costs, and they have estimates around that. And the other important point, so it's basically geographical mobility that allows all the other adjustments to take place. And I would be happy in the Q&A to try to elaborate on that. But the other point is that if we do not allow for this mobility, we have not only economic effects, but also we have long-lasting and wide-ranging effects in terms of on many dimensions of development, from education, child labor, crime, investment in physical and human capital of all sorts. Okay, next slide. So who benefits from trade most directly? Consumers. And here we have different papers. They all say that in different settings, China, Mexico, a range of developing countries, they all find that consumers benefit, but they also find that the impacts are uneven. And here there is still research, because for instance, Jaravel and Sager find that the low-income consumers benefit more, while other papers find that the richest households benefit more. However, I think what it's interesting, and this is the next slide, is to think of the mechanism of how consumers benefit. One slide back, perfect. And this is from the Locker and co-authors, and they say after a liberalization of input tariffs, the cost for producers is reduced. Those cost reductions are not passed through completely to consumers in lower prices, so profits increase, and this is an important point to keep a moment on the side. So what does it do? This fact that profits increase, in the short run, it means that producers benefit more than consumers, but the firms with the highest markup increase are also the ones that innovate the most. And so there are potentially dynamic gains that happen through product innovation and higher product quality that, that materialize over time. And indeed, the previous analysis on the labor share that I showed, they show also that there is over a long period of time a reduction of this negative shocks on workers, which are eventually consumers once they find new jobs. Okay, so next slide. So I said that profit increase, and I think this is really, and this is the last point of my presentation, I really think that this is the one point to keep an eye on and to try to understand how to accompany with policy, because we want companies to have enough profits to do a lot of innovation, and we saw that we need a lot of innovation, not last to solve the climate crisis. But also we need to make sure that this concentration of profits doesn't become destabilizing. And I think this is really an important research agenda. And so this is from famous work from the Locker and Aykut, where they show that there has been rising global market power everywhere. Next slide. And in the WDR, we also showed that this is in particular associated with firms that have market power in the lead of the global value chains. Next slide. And there again, we showed that it has a tax revenue implication, because it's hard to raise the tax revenue to basically compensate the losers. And to do social spending and investment. And the problem is bigger in proportionally to GDP, is bigger in developing countries than in developed countries. Next. And that this is also leading to some inequality, because we see this large drop in corporate income or income of the top 1%. And on par, we saw an increase in taxation of the average income. Okay, so this is basically the public fiscal systems do not manage to use globalization to correct for the losses. Next, but also this concentration in this concentration in market power, it's also creating some geostrategic tensions. And these geostrategic tensions are not only, so the concentration in market power, it's actually also a consequence of a more technological war that we have. And that's my last message. So the world and the way the high tech and a lot of the data-driven digital industries are changing is one where we have this multi-tiered, massively modular ecosystems made of giant companies that interact and depend on each other. And so next. And what we find is that it is the very change of this economic industrial organization landscape that might explain both why we see so much concentration of profits in few firms and why we see geostrategic tensions as a result of that. And the three reasons that we think are important is that these new technologies allow to do complex products in a large scale. Before you had the trade-off, either you were doing complex things or you were doing them simple but in a large scale. So it is this complexity at scale that brings the innovation, the quality, and the low prices we got used to, and that now we see some troubles with because of the aftermath of the pandemic. So the second, perhaps we can go through the other slides while I say that. So this is the complexity on a global scale, exactly. The second paradox is that we see market concentration and fragmentation. So it is a misperception to think that large companies, they dominate an entire industry. They dominate niches, and they are very interdependent on one another. So large companies like Google or Facebook, they do not do all the activities, and they do not dominate all the activities that allow them to do the product they are known for. They actually do a small part of that, and they rely on other extremely important and large companies to do those, like digital advertising, the search algorithms, of some specialized types, and so on and so forth. And so when you look at what's happening, is really this system of a very fragmented industrial landscape, but also very concentrated, because in each of this niche, there is basically one industry that is taking over all the other industry. And this is inherent on how digital technologies work. And so actually, this is like the main components of a smartphone industry, and the main message of this chart is just that each and every of them is considered highly concentrated if you use the US definition. But the smart ecosystem is highly fragmented. And so we have this second paradox, which leads to the third paradox that is important for what we want to discuss. So because of this market fragmentation, we also see geographic dispersion, meaning these large market leaders are located in different parts of the world. And the important thing is that it's not easy to move them to another part of the world, because the type of expertise, the capabilities, the depth and the range of capabilities that they need is too complex to reconstruct in another part of the world. So their location is much less mobile than we would expect. And so, and that creates large measures of global interdependence and supply chain vulnerabilities, because you have basically large entities that control neuralgic points of the most important industries. You can't move them from where they are located easily or in a short time. It takes many decades. And because of this importance, because we are moving away, we moved completely away from a perfect competition system, we have all these vulnerabilities. And so that brings me to my policy message, which is the following. So we need to really going forward to focus on disruptions and transitions, and not only on what happens at the steady state. In terms of national policies, as we saw, there is a lot of complexity. So the best thing that governments can do is to keep policies flexible, simple, and adaptive. Putting in practical conditions on any sorts of things might increase further the cost of adjustment, and read in this the labor mobility cost across all dimensions: geographic, occupational, and industrial. And there is, however, a potential justification for some place-based policies. On the international cooperation side, I think the main strong message is that some large measure of interdependence is here to stay. So we need to find a way to cope with it. Self-sufficiency can only be a solution for very limited contingencies. And anyway, it will come at the cost of dampening development prospects for poor countries, and that we need to keep in mind. And so multilateralism as a means to transparently identify and sanctions bad actors will be necessary, and an institutional solution will need to be developed. And I look very much forward to Ottaviano's intervention to enlighten us on what can be this institutional solution, and to the debate here in this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daria. That was a tour de force on trade-led development. And there are really so many issues and so many angles to tackle that we could very well have 2 or 3 more hours of conversation. But unfortunately, we don't have the time, but I am counting on Ottaviano to come in and provide some comments to your presentation and continue to enlighten us all. So Ottaviano, over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Annabelle. Thank you, Ngozi, for having me here. Thank you, Daria, for such a comprehensive, well-crafted, and delivered with competence presentation. Let me propose some comments trying to be complementary on some buckets of Daria's well-crafted presentation. First, on the gains from trade and the need, as well highlighted by Daria, to go beyond looking at steady states and looking at the frictions. Yes, see, the evidence that she collected, and by the way, I'm a follower of Daria's work, and I try to read everything that comes on my way since she arrived at the World Bank, particularly. And one point that comes out quite clearly from her presentation is the following. On the one hand, the evidence about the gains from trade and the global value chains, such as poverty reduction, productivity and growth, the lower Gini coefficient among countries, among per capita income of countries, accompanied by rising Gini coefficients within countries. This is beyond any doubt, it's quite clear. And she also highlights the relevance of trade adjustment costs, that there are always winners and losers. We know this since the times that we studied the models, the trade models, such as Hack-Shareholding and so on, that countries, once they integrate, the less abundant factors tend to suffer, although the net gains are positive, and some compensation may be necessary to make the positive net gains to become fully acceptable. Now, the problem is mostly on the implementation and on the commitment to those coping with those trade adjustment costs. Trade adjustment assistance for US workers displaced by import competition was first placed on the national agenda in the US in 1954. And Brazil, when did a partial trade opening in 1990, also included a component of adjustment. The World Bank trade strategy that was approved in June 2011, I was then the VP for something that no longer exists, the Poverty Reduction Economic Management VP, where the Trade Department was. And Daria was arriving at the bank at the time. And I remember well how we saw her as really a star. And well, and afterwards that was confirmed. That strategy had as one of its pillars managing shocks and promoting greater inclusion. And that was a cross-cutting pillar for the trade strategy. My point is that acknowledgement of the need to have trade adjustment mechanisms and actions and policy action has been there for long. But at the end of the day, it was on the policy side implementation that countries have failed to cope with those problems. I remember Professor Richard Baldwin for Geneva Institute, suggesting a negative correlation between strength of social protection systems and anti-globalization backlashes. The point was that the presence of good and comprehensive social protection systems might well explain why the backlash against globalization was so much different among developed countries. And the fact is that the idea that the Asian products and immigration were responsible for the impact on the lower part of the income pyramid ended up creating a ground for some politicians to use it as a part of an anti-globalization backlash. I'm thinking of President Trump's policies in the U.S. and Brexit. And Professor Baldwin always contrasted those cases with what was happening in Japan and Scandinavia. One important aspect as well, Daria's presentation led it quite clear. Typically, globalization is often presented as a factor explaining the Gini coefficient changes in advanced economies. Whereas let me quote a study brought by the IMF in the World Economic Outlook of October 2017 on the Chapter 4, Globalization and Equality, showing quite clearly that if you had to highlight a culprit for that, it was technology, not globalization. So literally, history could not be rewound in the sense that you could make advanced economies or those affected by globalization, advanced economies, great again. And one important aspect highlighted in Daria's presentation, and it's a great thing to work with, is the relevance of the factor adjustment costs, exactly, to explain the negative impacts of globalization in at least in the lower part of the income pyramid in advanced economies. And we should focus on disruptions and not only steady state, as Daria's quite well said. Now, second point, also quite important by Daria, the threats from technological change, the AI, robotization, 3D printers, and everything else bringing definitely higher chance for reshoring, for a regression vis-a-vis the what was obtained via the global value chains and the delocation of labor-intensive segments and so on. It comes to my mind, we think of shoes. Shoes have been a locus very much resistant to the introduction of technology displacing labor and so on. And I remember at my last days at the World Bank, when I read and accompanied a project of a shoe factory in Atlanta, combining 3D printing and custom-based shoe designs. That's really a threat to labor-intensive processes in making shoes in Asia. On the other hand, I also comes to mind a report, a book, 2017 by Mary Howard-Rimaya and Gaurav Nair, Trouble in the Making, where they grouped different sectors by pro-development characteristics and depicted a picture with a very high diversity, in the sense that those trends coming with AI and new trends in technology would not hit everywhere in the whole configuration of industry. And also, as Daria approached quite well, digitization is boosting service globalization. So newbalization may come from there. And I and her colleagues have done a very important work on the promises of a service-led development and so on. So I'm quite interested in knowing more what are the implications of global industries becoming modular, multi-tiered ecosystems for those development prospects. Third topic, and I'm running, the theme of a trade-off between efficiency and resiliency. Now, particularly after the pandemic or since the pandemic, we talk all the time about global value chains undergoing a reversal of globalization, deglobalization, and then we have friendshoring, nearshoring, etc. Yeah, because the supply chain disruptions accompanying the pandemic brought this issue to the fore. Something that was already there in mind since the Fukushima nuclear disaster and so on. But quite important, Daria's evidence about resilience coming not from geographic concentration, because the geographic concentration gives vulnerability to local shocks, and diversification matters. The GVC participation in global value chains increased exposure to international shocks, but it reduced the exposure to domestic shocks. I guess a good example of that has been the difficulties with here in the US with the baby milk, the infant formula, and attempted to be self-sufficient in things like those, exposed even more to domestic risk. So the logic of resilience and versus efficiency cannot be confounded with local sufficiency when it comes to what is produced by global value chains. And I would like to highlight the distinction between the two logic, the logic of the private sector and the public sector in dealing with this trade-off. See, in the private sector, the global value chain managers may, in some sectors, lead to replacement of a just-in-time by just-in-case. We may see, depending on the logic of the sector, inventories or even duplication of links of global value chains adopted as a response to this perceived vulnerability to shocks. Cost inefficiency would be a price to pay for higher resilience to shocks. But it's important to highlight this, because that logic will make this deglobalization limited. And that's why when I prefer to talk about possible relative deglobalization in the sense, but not abandonment or reversal of globalization as a trend from the private sector. And one scenario that cannot be ruled out is some sort of a partial deglobalization of goods and increased globalization of service. I guess a quite important aspect to take into account in this is the well-recognized difficulty of measuring what happens to service. And we need to be concerned not to overestimate the size of deglobalization because of those difficulties to measure what happens to service. Well, which leads me for a point to the public sector rationale. That's where the geopolitics comes in with force. But clearly, I believe that may become quite relevant. It is already relevant on high tech and on security sensitive segments. That includes semiconductors. Not by chance, President Biden's had not major difficulty in getting a bipartisan approval of his package on semiconductors. And that will probably be the case as well with medicaments and medical equipment. It comes to mind President Macron's first speech in 2020 on the pandemic, and what he's called as a need to review the line of strategic sectors. So how wide should be broadened such a line of strategic sectors? We should keep in mind that it is costly. Trade wars are costly. President Trump's war with China, according to a study by 2 Federal Reserve Bank staff, Aaron Flynn and Justin Peace, that was released in December 2019, and this study has been followed by others. The effect of President Trump's war with China with respect to the US manufacturing industry was the opposite. The net effect ended up being a reduction in US manufacturing employment, self-inflicted pains on the US manufacturing industry. So even if the trade war was painful from Mr. Trump's standpoint on the Chinese side, it was also costly, very much costly on the US side. Agriculture, of course, right away, but also in manufacturing. I strongly believe that this evidence will help the geopolitical disputes and so on to focus on sectors rather than being some sort of a generic, broad reversal of globalization. On friendshoring, nearshoring, and all that jazz, thanks, Annabelle, for coding the piece that I co-wrote with Justin In and Pep Jung. It came out just on the day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that may have taken off some attention to it. Finally, I'm getting there. Very well presented by Daria, other kinds of challenges brought by trade globalization, the tax issues, market power, and my suggestion is that these challenges should be tackled as such, rather than losing sight of the development gains that have been brought by trade. So we should attribute responsibilities to appropriately so as to avoid a misconfusion. And rebuilding the WTO, Daria is correct. I couldn't avoid remembering the times that I was at the bank, at the World Bank, and I went often to Geneva because of trade and so on. And I remember at the time, I'm talking about beginning of the last decade, a disenchantment with multilateral trade agreements, given then the difficulties to conclude the Doha agreement. And that's when I heard from several places that the way to go forward was by adopting plurilateral negotiations like the TPP or the TTIP. But as shown by the achievements of the 12th Ministerial Conference that happened last month, I'd like to quote Dr. Ngozi when she warned the WTO members that they should not rest on their laurels. According to Ngozi, quote, "We showed that we can deliver results for people across the globe, but success begets expectations. Because of the unprecedented outcomes at MC12, the world expects us to keep delivering," end quote. There's scope for reinforcing the WTO base as a forum in improving us in that regard, even if we have passed the time and the moment is not very much appropriate for very much more ambitious trade negotiations at the WTO. Thank you very much, Daria, for such a great presentation. Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, Ngozi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Ottaviano, for some great comments as well on many of the aspects of Daria's presentation. So again, there are many topics that can be tackled here, but there are a few that I'd like to highlight. And one is that all countries, but certainly the poorest countries, grow more in an open economy than in a closed economy. So that suggests to me that there is a very important role for trade cooperation and for the WTO to keeping, the global economy open. Second aspect that I want to highlight is this issue about resilience, because both Daria and Ottaviano, you were making the point, well, maybe in some sort of isolated sectors, we may see a bit more, a bit more of reshoring or nearshoring or some kind of self-sufficiency there. But the reality is that greater resilience, and the evidence points to this very clearly, that greater resilience comes from diversification. But for diversification, geographic diversification, for geographic diversification to work, again, we need an open trading system, because we need parts and pieces to be able to move from here to there. We need to have the technologies to move from here to there. So this is a second important point. And the third important point that I would like to highlight is the point that Daria was making. All this, the mixed effects of trade on the environment, and the role of new technologies to tackle the scale effects. And again, those new technologies are likely going to be produced in some parts of the world, but to counter the effects of trade across the world, more trade again will be needed. So to me, there's a very clear message that, in the current context in which we are, and if we want to take advantages or maximize the positive impacts of a trade-led development model, global trade cooperation is very much at the heart of it. But I think Daria was making a point in her presentation at the end, which is, well, maybe, rules will need to be strengthened because some of these bad and quote unquote actors, will need to be sanctioned. So maybe there's a need for new rules. And clearly there's a need also for an effective dispute settlement system to enforce those rules. So bringing it back to our Geneva context, I think these are some important elements to highlight. That, in addition to another very important point made, which is the role of domestic policies. And Ottaviano was referring to trade adjustment assistance, but also other policies very important. And Daria was referring to sort of new work that is being done on the role of labor mobility and how that is something that can help alleviate some of this pressure. So it's not easy, I think, for countries, but there are some clear guidelines here that I think are important. So with that liberty that I took, because I wanted to, just highlight some of this, as I said, really, really very comprehensive comments that both of you have provided. And I'm mindful that we don't have a lot of time, but I want to bring in a couple of questions from the audience. So we have, and thanks to all of you who have submitted questions. There are many of them. We have one that I think is very interesting, which is from Gustavo Barbosa, that basically says, or asks, how can developing countries move up in global value chains, including developing new technology and adopting more of the shelf-available technology? And where do you see are the bottlenecks to economic development? So let me maybe come back to you, Daria, first on this question, and then Ottaviano also to you as well.
Thank you. I'll be very short. What you said, Annabelle, I think it's at the heart of it. Without international rules that function and effective global cooperation, they will not be able to upgrade, I'm afraid, in a sustainable and long-lasting way. And that's why I think international cooperation is really fundamental to the development mission of the World Bank. And that's why I hope our two organizations will keep cooperating on that. So that's really necessary. I think the second thing that can be done at the national level is what we learned from all the attempt at industrial policy. At the end, it worked. So we have this more complex industries where deep and varied capabilities are important, and where it worked, it is because it was as a byproduct of the money that was being put in industrial policy. They were building human capital. And I would say my additional hinge for having looked at specific industries for a long time now is, I think, investment in knowledge of base materials, precisely to face the innovation that we will need to tackle the global problems, because those will become the engines of growth. So the upgrading will come from the usual domestic institutions that work, market access and so on. But then these two other legs really need to work: support to global cooperation, and really strong and with really commitment to it, and then investment in human capital and knowledge of base materials. Thanks.
Thank you, Daria. Ottaviano, your thoughts?
Yes, a fantastic question. You see, it's clear how globalization and GVCs have brought in spillovers of knowledge and available knowledge and scientific knowledge coming from the advanced countries. But for a country to, let's say, to climb up the ladder of value in global value chains, looking at the so far successful experience, it comes to the fore the necessity of a complementary domestic agenda. And I'm not having in mind here simply appropriate infrastructure. I'm not having in mind simply education of the labor force, the human capital accumulation. It comes to mind works done by our colleagues at the World Bank on what is called a set of complementary assets. You have to have a business environment that is appropriate for the local domestic accumulation of capabilities. The Caesar has two blades. You have to have the possibility of delving into the pool of knowledge from abroad, but you have to create domestically. You have to make sure you have an accumulation of capabilities, intangible assets. These are things that are tacit, idiosyncratic. They do not accompany simply blueprints of production and machine tools. They exist locally. And if we look at the IMF, for instance, did a work on mapping out the association between local investments in capabilities and the rise up of patents and R&D in China and South Korea. And our colleagues at the World Bank, when they have always mentioned this. So I would highlight the relevance of this domestic agenda of creating the conditions so as to make the gains from globalization being translated into local accumulation of capabilities. That's the secret. That's the way forward, the way up better.
Thank you to both of you. We have another question, and I think it's going to be our last one given our time constraints, from Mubarak Ali from India. And he's sort of saying, I think, in this complex landscape that you're presenting today, so where are you seeing accelerated trade growth? What parts of the world are you seeing sort of moving forward in this new and arguably more challenging trade and investment landscape, but also clearly new opportunities arising, everywhere from services globalization to upgrading in value chains and others. So Daria, you want to come in?
Yeah, good question. But I wouldn't be able to respond right now because with the new challenges, this is actually a question we are asking ourselves. I don't have answers yet, sorry.
Great, but we'll be looking forward to answers in the future. Ottaviano, you want to take a attack at it?
Just a small take, because I face the same difficulties that Daria mentioned to respond to this. I must confess that not long ago, I start seeing or proposing an idea of overlapping globalizations or parallel globalizations. Parallel if they were maintained separate one from each other. A process, on the one hand, pulling back the segments because of the technological transformation, but also simultaneously a process by which those countries that have succeeded in industrializing over the last decades might start facing themselves the Arthur Lewis type of a challenge of a rising wage, and then we might have a delocation, a further delocation of labor-intensive activities elsewhere. At my times at the bank, I visited factories of leather-related products transplanted from China to Ethiopia. And we also saw how Vietnam and Cambodia were tracking, let's say, the location of processes installed previously in China. So I dreamed of having these two simultaneous parallel processes, and the Belt and Road would help in that regard. But today, unfortunately, we have this contamination of the geopolitical disputes. Hopefully, the disastrous type of policies implemented by President Trump's government with respect to trade will not be forgotten, and so the extent of the deglobalization will be lower than what some fear. But to be seen. We are living through extraordinary times, particularly as we are living through a perfect storm with all kinds of shocks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ottaviano. You know, the more I listen to you, I think the more relevant is the message that I would like to leave with all of you, which is that effective trade cooperation is absolutely critical if we are to navigate the challenges that we are confronting today. So with that message, let me thank very much Daria for a fantastic presentation, and Ottaviano for some fantastic comments on this important topic of trade-led development. We'll be watching more. So for you in the audience, stay tuned and look out for Daria and for Ottaviano for some great discussions. So thank you all very much. Bye-bye.